Kia ora koutou. Welcome to your last day of the Institute. I hope you have enough brain power to make it through these last couple of sessions, and I look forward to chatting with you about staying with the trouble when we meet following this seminar. Um, Before we begin, I'll just share a little bit about me, my background. I am originally from Georgia. I went to do my undergraduate at the University of Colorado, however, at Boulder. Majored in environmental studies, got my first position teaching outdoor environmental ed in North Georgia, actually, so came back to Georgia at the start of the Appalachian Trail there. You can see the stream ecology studies, those kids out in the stream. That's part of the work that I did while I was there. And then my first classroom teaching position, was in the South Bronx in New York City. I taught science and ESOL at Community Junior High School 145 on Teller Avenue. And after that, I spent a few years there. And then afterwards, I decided I wanted to go get better at my Spanish and explore possibilities in environmental studies careers. So I went to Latin America on a 6-month volunteer program through World Teach and Rare. And I ended up staying for 3 years. I started in Chiapas, San Cristobal, and ended up staying and working in Baja California, Tikal, Guatemala, and the Yucatan Peninsula, and largely looking at supporting local people to design and implement ecotours that were conservation-based. And part of that was to keep the ecotourism industry out of the hands of foreign tour operators. And the work was a partnership with UNESCO. So the areas in which I worked, communities with which I worked, were located in or near World Heritage Sites. So after staying in Latin America for about 3 years, I went back to Atlanta and taught for a little while. And that was around the time that No Child Left Behind had come into effect. So I went back to get my permanent credential, and I ended up going to University of Georgia in Athens, where I was for 2 years, getting my master's and teaching credential at the same time. While I was there, I worked for the Center for Latino Achievement and Success in Education, and became interested in teacher education as I was working with teachers to help support them in thinking about what it means to teach science in multilingual classrooms and how to implement culturally empowering practices in science classrooms with diverse students. So I did that while I was there and thought, well, this teacher education is pretty powerful. I also saw a lot of gaps in my own teacher education experience. I felt like the curriculum, or the teacher education curriculum, for me didn't adequately speak to my experiences as an educator, and didn't really speak to issues of social justice and equity in the ways that I had hoped. So I went to the University of California at Santa Cruz to kind of continue that journey of problem posing and studying, like, what does it mean, to teach in these very rigid institutions that, were facing real constraints, but also to find and create pockets of resistance. While I was at UC Santa Cruz exploring those questions, I also continued to do work with pre-service and in-service teachers around what it means to teach in multilingual science classrooms, and how can we teach in ways that are inclusive and responsive in linguistically diverse classrooms, and teach in contextualized and empowering ways. So I continued to do that while at UC Santa Cruz, and then graduated, got my first position at University of Arizona, and was at University of Arizona, where I was working in science education for about 7.5 years, and then came to Aotearoa, New Zealand, after meeting the head of school at a conference, who had invited me to come and try out a position here. And I've really been enjoying it. So we stayed. It's been 2.5 years, and we are really loving it so far. So I came with my partner and my 2 children, the oldest of whom, Yema, at the bottom right-hand corner, actually was born while I was getting my PhD in Santa Cruz. And the other one, Michaela, or Mikey we call her, was born when I was a first-year faculty member at University of Arizona. So those were definitely challenging times, as I'm sure many of you can also relate to, but we spent a lot of time together, and I really do love the time that we have and cherish it. We're here. You can see we're sitting in front of boxes. I thought it was an appropriate picture because we do spend a lot of time moving around. I wrote my dissertation in Singapore, actually, where my partner is from. And so I thought this was a good picture that represented our experiences. We're moving. It's kind of hectic and chaotic in the background, but we're happy. So that's me, and welcome to all of you. So we're looking at staying with the trouble. What are these inescapable troubles of interdependent existences? How does Haraway talk about staying with the trouble? Can we think about staying with the trouble? How is staying with the trouble not just a concept, but also a method and a pedagogy and a conceptual framework? So we're going to talk a little bit about what is the trouble. We're going to look at how Haraway talks about SFs. And then we're going to talk a little bit about why we should stay with the trouble in this first part of my seminar. So Haraway says in her book, trouble is an interesting word. It derives from a 13th century French verb meaning to stir up, to make cloudy, to disturb. We, all of us on Terra, live in disturbing times, mixed up times, troubling and turbid times. The task is to become capable, with each other and all of our bumptious kinds, of response. Mixed up times are overflowing with both pain and joy, with vastly unjust patterns of pain and joy, with unnecessary killing of ongoingness, but also with necessary resurgence. The task is to make kin and lines of inventive connection as a practice of learning to live and die well with each other in a thick present. Our task is to make trouble, to stir up potent response to devastating events, as well as to settle troubled waters and rebuild quiet places. So if you haven't already, I would like you to pause your video and go watch the first 5 minutes, just the first 5 minutes of This Changes Everything, which is free on YouTube, but I couldn't link it directly to the Prezi because it has some kind of filter on it that apparently is not age appropriate for anybody under 18, which is a whole other interesting topic that we could probably go on about. But if you haven't yet, can you please pause the video and go watch the first 5 minutes of This Changes Everything. The link is available in your syllabus under my session. So if you go there now and click the link, watch the first 5 minutes, and then come back. So Naomi Klein says, when she's talking about the scientists of the Royal Society and how they're trying to solve the problems of climate change by putting more pollution into the sky, basically, she says, here's the thing on that process, solar engineering. The idea may be crazy, but it's also totally logical within the story that the Royal Society pioneered in the 17th century. Here's how it goes. The Earth is not, as most people thought back then, a mother to be feared and revered. No, science had granted men godlike powers. The Earth is a machine, and we are its engineers, its masters. We can sculpt it like a country garden. We can extract it from whatever we want. These scientists help turn the mother into the mother lode. This story is where the long road to global warming began. When I realized that, Naomi Klein says, I stopped tuning out those sad polar bears because unlike human nature, stories are something we can change. So I like this first 5 minutes from This Changes Everything. And the book is great too. If you haven't read it, you really should. The idea is the trouble is not only the ecological, the socio-political and economic challenges we face, but also the stories that we tell about them. So Haraway talks a lot about string figures as a process of storytelling. So she uses string figures as a method, especially in chapter 3, to go through a series of connecting events, but also with the pigeons that she talks about in that first chapter. Thinking about making odd kin, these interactions of people and materialities and more than human and how they come together in sometimes surprising ways. So she talks about these stories and this process of storytelling as SFs, science fiction, speculative feminism, science fantasy, speculative fabulation, science fact, and string figures. So she says, quote, this book argues and tries to perform that, eschewing futurism, staying with the trouble is both more serious and more lively. Staying with the trouble requires making odd kin. That is, we require each other in unexpected collaborations and combinations. and hot compost piles. We become with each other or not at all. It matters what matters we use to think other matters with. It matters what stories we tell to tell other stories with. It matters what knots knot knots, what thoughts think thoughts, what descriptions describe descriptions, what ties tie ties. It matters what stories make worlds, what worlds make stories. So a really good example of this idea of new connections and collaborations and the stories we use, the stories we weave as academics, as activists. So Sub Rosa is a cyber feminist collective of artists, and they've done several installations around the US. And so I have a link here to one of their installations at the Pittsburgh Biennial called Feminist Matters, Propositions and Undoing. And this is a collective inquiry about how feminist knowledge sharing might inform bench-side approaches to scientific method and science pedagogy. So thinking about bringing together the sciences with feminist methods and feminist activisms and feminist knowledge and how that might change the sciences. And then I've written about this as well with a colleague, Jessie Bazul, in 2019 in our article on living science education for a damaged planet. We write how cyber feminist collective Sub Rosa points out how activist coalitions and minoritized communities are already engaged in subversive and creative acts, producing new forms of democratic life. It is exactly this kind of creativity in community, a creativity that refuses to be repressed, that can guide our work. We envision creative and imaginative, responsible engagements with science-related issues that can begin anywhere. So this is what I'm starting with, this idea of creative reimaginations and storytelling, looking at multi-species survival, and how responsibility demands an infidelity to purisms, according to Haraway. It requires a passion and action, detachment and attachment, a collective knowing and doing, an ecology of practices. So I've written as well about how creative and responsible engagements might begin with or in activist struggles, arts, critical studies, indigenous scholarship, queer theory, decolonial politics, feminisms, borderlands, science studies, experimentation. We don't pretend to know what or how. What we do know is that continued multi-species survival on a damaged planet demands radical reimaginations. So in the next part of this session, I'm going to share a string figure that helped engage our radical imagination around what other stories and worlds are possible and how I'm using that string figure to then think about my own research and teaching through insect entanglements. In the second part of this seminar, we're going to look at a string figure story about killer bees. We probably all have some prior strongly emotive association with killer bees that ranges from fascination to abject fear or somewhere in between. The killer bee is an interesting string figure of multi-species entanglements and becomings. I'll start by playing a short video that is emblematic of how we often hear killer bees in the media. The dominant narratives about killer bees, also known as Africanized bees, are the exotic, intrusive other that seeks to invade and to harm us, are pervasive. Man introduces, man can't control what he has made, man exterminates. Nature is creative, subversive, and rhizomatic, however. How did killer bees come to be? According to Arne Jernaloff, agriculturalists, entomologists, and geneticists sought to improve the productivity of the Italian honeybee in Brazil. Warwick Kerr, a geneticist, imported fertilized queens of South African bees, Apis mellifera scutellata, and interbred them with the European honeybee to, according to Jernaloff, produce a bee that incorporated, quote, an intensive grooming urge, which makes them less susceptible to parasites like mites, with more industrious nectar foraging, leading to more honey production. As honey theft was also a problem for Brazilian beekeepers, the fact that the African bees defend their hives more aggressively than the Italian one was also seen as a plus. The crossbreed has even been given a Latin subspecies name of its own, A.M. adansoni, end quote. In the late 1950s, however, over 20 colonies of hybridized as well as the African bees escaped in the state of Minas Gerais. These bees were much more aggressive than European honeybees. In 1964, a military coup d'etat took place in Brazil, and generals formed a military government to overthrow the leftist government. Warwick Kerr, the geneticist, was a fierce critic and vocal opponent of the new regime. As Journaloff has written, given Kerr's reputation as a world-renowned geneticist, it was easier to discredit him than to assassinate him. The government-sponsored media began an aggressive propaganda campaign to link Kerr's name with the killer bee monsters he had created, disseminating reports about livestock and people being killed by the Frankenbees. In 1965, Time magazine in the US picked up on the reports from Brazilian media and coined the term killer bees. The killer bees soon became an international sensation, Kerr's Frankenstein monster. For me personally, I remember the profound effect this media sensationalism had on me as a child in the 1980s, watching the nightly news with my dad on TV, trying to make sense of the foreboding maps forecasting the impending doom of killer bees making their way to North America. The story became much more personal in the summer of 2016 in Tucson, Arizona, when we began to discover bees coming in through the vents in our house. We would often find bees in the nightlight next to my 4- and 6-year-old daughter's beds. We would carefully remove them and set them free. Interestingly, they seemed fairly docile and lethargic like the rest of us in the dry heat of the summer desert. Given what we knew about the precarity of bees, we were in some ways even happy to see them, not knowing that they were the Africanized bees. Meanwhile, my youngest daughter had become a friend to the bees. We had decided to find a way to arrange for a live hive removal. By the time we got back from a short weekend trip to a friend's wedding, an increasing number of bees were busily buzzing and flying in front of the window outside the girl's bedroom. We decided it was time to call a technician. I wrote this short poem about the time when we were outside of our house and a bee landed on her, and I tried to shoo it away, and as I did, it crawled under her dress. So I was really, really nervous and explained to her that she had a bee on her, and so this is how this short story goes. "There's a bee on your head," I told her. She smiled at me, waiting for instructions. I drew in my breath as the bee crawled from her head beneath her dress. "Don't move," I warned. "It tickles," she giggled. I gently lifted up her dress. The bee flew off. "You're so brave," I said. "It tickled," she reminded me. She's barely 5. One can only be brave in the face of fear, after all. Well, this story made me think a lot about how my own fear was kind of shaping her experience with the bees, but then she instead actually reshaped mine. My own experiences with the killer bee and my interaction with the technician led me to wonder how the killer bee has become caught in a web of narratives of despair, of the dangers of Frankenstein-like scientific meddling in God's creations, compounded by othering narratives of the exotic intruders. I wondered what counter-stories existed below the surface. So living with killer bees, growing up, as I explained before, I remember periodically seeing glimpses of news reporters on the nightly news showing maps of how Africanized bees were migrating northward from South America. The news reports of the aggressive nature of these attack bees left me as a child feeling particularly paranoid about bees. Now, as an adult living in southern Arizona, dealing with Africanized bees has become a summer routine. The first time we found a hive on our roof, we wanted to have the hive extracted as a live removal. A 70-pound hive, as it turned out. The bee service provider indicated that it would be impossible, causing a potentially life-threatening hazard to our small children or elderly neighbors. He shared with us that, in fact, all the hives were Africanized in Arizona except for the local beekeepers who raised the American honeybee. I remember him exclaiming, "These bees are not the good guys." In another incident the following year, we discovered a hive on the other side of our house. This time we shared with the service provider our concerns about live removal after learning from the last experience that essentially all honeybees, unless they're raised by beekeepers in Arizona, are Africanized. Though she agreed that live removal certainly had its risks, she also shared that while the Africanized bees are aggressive pollinators, they are seemingly taking on more of the American honeybee's gentler, lazier disposition as they migrate north and continue to interbreed with the American honeybee, while at the same time maintaining the Africanized bee's rigorous work ethic. The Africanized bee also appears less susceptible to colony collapse disorder. At the same time, they are still widely considered a serious public health threat, responsible for a handful of deaths each year in Arizona, mostly among hikers and pets. Meanwhile, Arizona ranks as one of the top 20 states with the highest rates of death by gun, yet not a public health threat. So in thinking about what counter stories existed below the surface, as I realized that my own relationship with these killer bees was changing through the interactions I'd had with them as they found a safe space in my house, I thought about how killer bees are in fact a biological success. They've been referred to by the Natural History Museum in the UK as family-oriented and nest-proud, which is a really interesting way to think about how they empty their hives if they feel threatened, to come and protect each other from potential harm. Their venom is actually no more harmful than the average Western honeybee, and they have less of it. They're also smaller than the average Western honeybee. They're harder workers, fastidious pollinators, and honey producers. And they can actually forage at much greater distances than the Western honeybee. In fact, with the arrival of the hybridized bees, Mexico has seen a rise in their honey production. But we should revert to the other side of the despair versus progress narrative, i.e. that killer bees will save us, is certainly not the argument I'm trying to make here. They pollinate both native and intrusive plants, which catalyzes the growth and spread of non-native species. This is something that the Western honeybees don't do. Some beekeepers don't appreciate their more aggressive nature, and they can clearly pose a public health threat, especially for more than human animals, the elderly and young children, as well as those with bee allergies. However, the fact that they are fastidious pollinators and less susceptible to colony collapse disorder are clearly hopeful characteristics in the area of declining bee populations. The Natural History Museum has stated, quote, "It has therefore been considered that resistant killer bees could help solve the problem of Western honeybee decline, but the hybrid's poor reputation remains a challenge." Interestingly, they are becoming calmer as they continue to interbreed with the Western honeybee and migrate north. The Natural History Museum report also goes on to say, quote, "A study in 2012 found that Africanized bees in Puerto Rico were less aggressive than those on mainland North America. The bees first invaded the island in 1994, but they appear to have become more docile over time with no fatalities in recent years, although perhaps the people of Puerto Rico have just learned to live with their new neighbors," end quote. This makes me wonder about interactions between our discourse around killer bees and the ways that they orient to us and vice versa. What does it mean to live well with the A.M. Adansonii? The stories we tell matter, and of course there are implications for living with other human and more than human species beyond just the killer bees. In this last and final session of Staying with the Trouble, I want to connect the stringed story about becoming killer bees to Numalo and Pachini Ketchaba's work on staying with the trouble in Child Insect Educator Common Worlds. Numalo and Pachini Ketchaba reflect on how children and teachers work through the ethico-political entanglements of living and learning with, quote, "introduced animals in a space whether the effects and affects of killing and making killable are part of modes of learning," end quote. They write that, quote, "common world pedagogies are certainly not about helping children to arrive at clear answers. Rather, they're about staying with the trouble of recuperation by questioning capitalist practices of commodified enclosure that have brought the stick insects to this urban childhood center, and simultaneously paying attention to the affective and imperfect practices of care detachment that are always present in settler colonial spaces in troubled times of anthropogenic damage," end quote. It is these forms of staying with the trouble that characterize the affective and imperfect practices of care detachment in living with killer bees. So I start this next string figure with another narrative of despair in the Anthropocene in order to create ruptures in it. As Haraway has written in Chapter 1, pigeons, people, and apparatus have teamed up to make each other capable of something new in the world of multi-species relationships. I think the hybridized bees are an example of this possibility. Bazul in 2020 writes that solidarity, and this is a quote, "Solidarity as a shared sense of unity and dependence is an aspect of collective existence that needs to be more readily extended to non-humans," end quote. While Bazul acknowledges that interrelatedness and forms of solidarity underpin indigenous ontoepistemologies, he highlights that the absence of these ideas in Western education, quote, "solidarity with non-humans might seem strange, but only because a Western education does not provide the creative space to think about codependence on an ontological level. It would require being open to what Gatsambide Fernandez refers to as creative solidarity, where there's a focus on new ways of being in solidarity that cannot be easily expressed in the current order of things. Capitalism, along with colonialism, relies on the alienation of humans from non-humans, not just humans from their agency. Solidarity depends on sharing permeable and leaky worlds. The only thing keeping humans from exploring this kind of solidarity are the impermeable boundaries that separate humans from other forms of life and non-life. One of the most powerful things educators can do is extend solidarity to non-humans by allowing children and adults to explore multiplicitous relationships with non-humans, even when these relationships are trivialized as merely ways of adjusting to the real world that awaits them. Whilst capitalism and other controlling forces try to eliminate the spectral and inexhaustible quality of things, an education for the commons allows insects, air, and books to keep their infinite qualities by affirming a larger sense of solidarity that is ontologically foundational. There's no good reason why educators can't simultaneously demonstrate the tenacity of power relations whilst also showing students that things like ice and flowers can be touched, inhaled, and measured, that is accessed in infinitely expansive ways. End quote. Again, it's my children and our children in general, my daughter mostly in this case, but children who have taught me the most about solidarity with more than humans. So I included a few poems from what she's been teaching me or what she's taught me in the past in the piece that you would have read for this in preparation for the seminar, what I learned from her about making kin with bugs. As we were eating breakfast, I shouted, "Go away, fly." She scolded me for yelling at the fly, who's probably just looking for food. "Housefly," she said, "wherever you are. I'm so sorry about my mom." "Mom," she says to me, "did you know that mosquitoes only bite you so they can make their babies?" "Yes," I told her. A newfound understanding, a kinship settled onto her tiny face. "Well," she said disappointedly, "why didn't you tell me that before?" That night, tears filled her eyes when I flushed a palmetto bug, the American cockroach, down the toilet. They only want to find homes. I promised not to do it again. So what does all this mean for science education? I want to refer back to Donna Haraway's concept of symbiosis. If it is true that neither biology nor philosophy any longer supports the notion of independent organisms and environments, that is, interacting units plus context and rules, then symbiosis is the name of the game in spades. Bounded or neoliberal individualism amended by autopoiesis is not good enough figuratively or scientifically. It misleads us down deadly paths. What does this mean for teaching and learning? I've been exploring with pre-service teachers who are learning to teach science in primary settings through experience that tries to cultivate symbiosis and kaitiakitanga, which I'll talk about in a moment. And so one of these activities is investigating the driving question, what is in the soil and why it lives there? So we work out in the garden and look at live soil samples to find out what lives there and think about why it might be there and notice things that we might not have otherwise noticed before. I'd like to share with you next a couple of videos from pre-service teachers who have given permission for me to use these and are working out in the garden on these soil samples.
Yeah, I just looked at it. It's nothing.
Man, those slaters are doing some work, hey?
Yeah.
Oh, found it.
Do we know what they do?
I don't know.
He is just cruising around, man.
They're really fast.
So
And the worms are always in the clump. They're always in clumps of dirt.
I feed worms to my axolotl.
Axolotl.
Check that white one out, look.
After 7 in the morning.
Beside that slater, can you see it?
Is it where you hold it?
It's moving.
See that?
Yeah,
Oh yeah. What is it?
it's so little.
It's like a little tiny worm. It looks like a what do you call it? Maggot.
John, have a look. Like it looks like a little bit of a root, but
Looks
it's
like a maggot. Oh, and there's a tiny bug. Oh, you can't see it. It's all the way down there. It's like a speck.
there's all sorts in here, man.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have my kids out of the garden this weekend now.
If I had kids, I'd do it too.
She's got a tail. Oh, I don't know which one her head is.
Like a
That's her
beetle?
head. No. She's got an orange head.
It doesn't say here.
Oh yeah, there he is.
It's got little antlers at the back of its body as well. That's quite funny.
No. Is it? Yeah, springtail.
I don't know.
Looks like it though, because it's like little. Is it? Yeah. It's got quite a long tail.
Get my sausage fingers in your photo. That's quite cute. I like you. I'm going to just call you Patricia.
Can you say that last bit again? Just what you were saying about the death and life. Can you say that again?
Yeah, so soil that has no life is called dirt, but for life to exist, there needs to have been death within the soil. So, I mean, it's just all a system of picking out nutrients and resources from that death to turn it into more life.
That's activity is that we found while some of the groups we worked with really did seem to be able to reorient to insects as more than human companions and really engage with the idea of becoming with through the experience that we had provided without much other prompting. Other groups were more, I guess, slower to become engaged in those kinds of processes. And with a TA who I've been working with and as a co-instructor, we thought a little bit about what that was about and how we might redesign the lesson in the future or for future groups to help them attend more to care and understand multiple vulnerabilities, because we saw it's not just about understanding the science, and it's not even about participating in scientific practice, although that's a big part of this course as well, is helping them to experience scientific practice and become engaged in that more authentically. But that's not the only goal. And so while some groups moved past that idea of engaging in the activity as a process of identifying soil animals and being able to answer the driving question based on evidence, we were really looking for something more, and not all the groups were able to get there. So we did some thinking and thought, what else could we draw from? What other types of activities might we engage them in? And so we came up with this idea that we needed to use art, that art can do what science can't. And so we had the next few groups, after they did the same soil animals activity and worked with the soil and got to know their soil animals, they answered the driving question and created their scientific models. They also wrote poetry. So I'll share with you next a couple of the poems that they wrote, and again, share videos of those poetry readings with the students' permission as well.
Where would we be without a worm? I see a worm in my veggie garden and I don't squirm when I see a worm. Scavenging slaters supplying our squash with secretions of shite. Creepy, crawly centipedes living in the deep, dark depths, contributing to the circle of life. Ants aerating our abundance of compost, with earwigs eating every earthly gettable morsel. So when your veggies are on your plate, please remember your creepy crawly mate.
Flutterby, flutterby, you are not a butterfly. Got some dust, but I cannot trust you with my lettuce. That's a poem about a moth. And then I've got, he was a Slater boy, he said see you later boy.
Made us reflect on how knowledge hierarchies are produced and constituted and reproduced in science. And we, thinking about the fact that we felt the art had this power that science didn't have, I think was a really useful exercise for deconstructing these knowledge hierarchies. And as Singh and others have talked about, we need to practice the arts of living on a damaged planet, and that's just as important if not more, than learning to engage in scientific practice and understand what's going on. We also have to learn to be in relation with and to become with. And this also made me think about Haraway's reflections in the first chapter on who renders him capable of what, when she's talking about the project with the pigeons and their role in mapping environmental justice issues. But yet, because it was art, it wasn't seen as legitimate or as worthy of funding. And so she talks about the author of this pigeon blog, Beatriz de Costa, who renders whom capable of what and at what price, borne by whom. And she asked, is human animal work as part of political and art action less legitimate than the same type of activity when framed under the umbrella of science? So I think as science educators in particular, these are really incredibly important questions for us to be considering. In what ways do we engage in knowledge hierarchies or the reproduction of science as the ultimate truth at the top of the hierarchy? And then what is the collateral damage of doing so? And I think we do this now, especially in the time of the pandemic. And there are particular reasons why we want to remind people about the authority and power of science. But I think we have to also reflect on the ways that we do that and again, how we do it and what is the collateral damage. So I want to talk a little bit more that I mentioned this practice of kaitiakitanga. Basically, kaitiakitanga is in New Zealand, in Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's a traditional indigenous Maori concept or practice or way of being. It essentially means guardianship or protection. It's often interpreted as such. And from the Science Learning Hub, they define kaitiakitanga as guardianship or protection. And just talk about the basic meaning of tiaki is to guard, but it also depends on the context, because it can mean keep, nurture, protect. So I think this is really interesting to think about. It's often translated as guardianship, but in talking with another Maori educator in my department, we've had several discussions about actually the true meaning of kaitiakitanga and how it's often given this sort of incomplete translation of guardianship. It's actually a recognition of interdependent existences. It's, if you look at ko aho te awa, ko te awa ko aho, the river is me and I am the river. So it's the idea that there is no separation. There is no real sense of an independent existence. So it's a recognition that our coexistence, our existences are entangled. And there's not one without the other, rather than a sense of guardianship, because I think that's like a Western infusion of dominion over nature. It's actually an acknowledgement of the interdependent existence. So we do talk a lot about kaitiakitanga in our science education courses as well, and in all of our courses. And there's a real emphasis in Aotearoa, New Zealand, on teaching Mataranga Māori in all of our coursework as part of the Treaty of Waitangi, or I should say Te Tiriti o Waitangi. So we do a lot of work around kaitiakitanga in science in particular. And doing this investigation with soil animals really made me think about what is kaitiakitanga in this particular case where, to be honest, some of our insect companions didn't survive the investigation. So we went out to the garden and we used their soil from the compost, and I brought some of my own soil from my own compost. But in several rounds of investigations with multiple groups of pre-service teachers, we had some insects and some worms that didn't survive, and it made me wonder what is our ethical and political obligation in that context, and how do we think about care and vulnerabilities? And as I mentioned earlier from the Numalo piece on the role of there not necessarily being a clear ethical path. So being part of this complex ethical dilemma. And it also made me think a little bit about a workshop or a webinar that I attended recently on, using Mataranga Maori or integrating Mataranga Maori in science, and especially in primary science settings. And there was one example that was given from this project. It's a participatory science project in Aotearoa, New Zealand, that children participate in. It's a moth identification project called Ahipepe, and children around Aotearoa, New Zealand can collect moths and identify them, but part of the work is that they have to actually create a field collection, which means they have to euthanize moths. So they have to euthanize one moth from, I think, every species that they find. And so this, to me, also presented a dilemma. And in the webinar that I watched, the response to that was that they would just say a karakia, which is a kind of an acknowledgement or a prayer. But it didn't seem to really engage the conflict, I didn't feel. And so I wondered if there might be another way to really acknowledge, as Puig de la Bella Casa talks about, the interdependent beings, the concrete work of maintenance that has ethical and affective implications as a vital politics in interdependent worlds. So I wondered about how that could have been done differently or with more care, perhaps. And fortunately, I was able to find a really lovely example that I'll share with you now on one school that actually did really take this up, this concept up, because a young child brought it to their attention, and they really took this up, and I think and with care. So I'm going to share that video with you now.
My cultural lens, which is a Māori lens placed over science, has been interesting. We've had some cultural clashes in terms of Western ideology and science and how we teach our tamariki about kaitiakitanga. Everything in the world has a mauri, it has a life force, and therefore we should respect that. And with the science, it was a tikanga challenge when we had to euthanize the moths. We're supposed to be cherishing these creatures in our school environment, and now we have to think about putting them to sleep. And this was a challenge for myself and my team of teachers, and also for the students. So much so we had one student, which was quite profound, why do we have to kill them?
It was like his second week at school, and so this is this little 5-year-old kid, and we're sitting in the circle, and you know, at the end of every discussion we say, any questions? And Te Apanui, 5 years old, says, why do we need to kill them? We asked the questions some time back when we first start being a scientist, but then we kind of just keep going, and it's good sometimes to pause and think, okay, so why am I actually killing these moths? Do I need to do this? What's my reasoning? And yet this little group of kids, they were saying, no, we don't want to kill them. And these are the moths that we're going to use for the experiment. We're going to say a quick thank you to the moths that we have taken from the trap. Anyone who wants to say thank you, now is the time to thank you for the moths.
That slowed the project until we could, all as a whānau, students, teachers and the wider whānau, had a conversation about how that could happen.
One of the reasons that it's really important to sacrifice them is in order to make a reference collection, because it makes identification easier. From the science point of view, reference collections and museum collections are really important because they are a bank of information that is curated and it's kept safe for future generations.
The students came up with, well, we could just look at them and identify them as best we can, or we could take a photo of them and put them in the cloud and then see if we can identify them through that means instead of creating a collection. Or if we decided to create a collection, which means we have to put the moths to sleep, which was the term that they preferred, then we wouldn't take a whole lot of the same whānau, the same species. We would maybe say 2 would be enough for us to identify and use in science. So I thought that's pretty deep thinking. That's pretty good for students that are trying to find a way forward. They want to be the scientists and use this equipment and gain these skills, but they want to minimise the impact on their cultural beliefs as much as possible.
So the solution to this was to take that on board and take that learning into the project. And so we've developed a protocol that we're all comfortable with, from the science point of view, from the kura point of view, and from the kaitahu point of view, and also from the Orokonui Eco Sanctuary point of view. Whāia Huia has made a nice karakia, which we say beforehand.
We do a karakia, which is kind of like we're thanking them for sacrificing their lives.
And then we take the moths and we euthanize them. And the best way of doing that is by putting them in the freezer, and they get really cold and they go to sleep, and then they don't wake up.
Pau is an important element of appreciation in tikanga Māori. The pau for the pepe tuna was to give thanks to Tāne Mahuta, to Rehua, for gifting them to the earth, and we have just now used them for our science and will respect them. So the students use the pau to acknowledge the higher sources who've gifted these pepe to us to learn from and to be respectful of, so that we can continue on with kaitiakitanga and the sustainability across all the elements that we're learning here at Kura. It's part of our tikanga.
So I think that last video really does embody this idea of how a feminist-inspired vision of caring cannot be grounded in the longing for a smooth, harmonious world, or in their case, an Indigenous-inspired vision, but in vital, ethico-affective, everyday practical doings that engage with the inescapable troubles of interdependent existences. Haraway reminds us that we are all responsible to and for shaping conditions for multi-species flourishing in the face of terrible histories, and sometimes joyful histories too. But we are not all responsible in the same ways. The differences matter in ecologies, economies, and species. So I'll leave you with those quotes. As you go, think about, some of these concepts and ideas here. And a writing prompt is to think about how we're differently responsible, and think about these entanglements as string figures. And if it's useful to you, create, draw, map, or write a string figure that represents your current research problem or a future possible research problem, or let's just call it a complex phenomenon. It doesn't have to be a problem per se. Think about the bee story and insect symbiosis as one example of a string figure, or perhaps two string figures loosely connected. And then in your own work, what unexpected connections and oddkin can you make or tie outside of the boundaries of science, education, research, or NGSS, or cross-cutting concepts, or other frameworks and binaries that might be restricting your radical imaginations? So I'll leave you with that. And I look forward to seeing you soon during our discussion, and hopefully we'll get a chance to share some of those with each other if you have some time to brainstorm. Remember, it doesn't have to be a masterpiece, just some initial ideas. And I'll see you later today. Ka kite.